Claire Whitmore wouldn't give you a promotion, Jonathan Mercer said, sliding a black leather folder across the restaurant table. So I'm prepared to give you the company. Ethan Cole stared at the folder but did not touch it. Outside the window, rain glazed downtown Chicago in silver, turning headlights into long streaks across the glass. Jonathan sat opposite him, 61 years old, founder of Mercer Dynamics, and the one man Claire's board had spent a decade trying to beat. That's not funny, Ethan said. I'm not joking. Jonathan opened the folder. The first page carried Ethan's name beneath a title he had never expected to see: President and Successor. His phone vibrated beside his water glass. A message from his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Dad, do they finally see what you can do? Ethan read it twice, then turned the phone face down. The answer was complicated, because 48 hours earlier, the woman he had spent 6 years quietly protecting had looked him in the eye and decided he was not ready to lead. 2 days earlier, at 9:03 Monday morning, Ethan stood near the back of Aldridge Systems' executive conference room, while Claire Whitmore prepared to announce the company's new vice president of operations. 42 employees watched from rows of gray chairs. More joined through video screens from offices in Dallas, Denver, and Atlanta. Ethan wore the same navy suit he had owned for 7 years. Sophie had straightened his tie before school and made him promise to text her when the decision came. Around him, people kept offering quiet congratulations before Claire had even spoken. They had reasons. When the Phoenix distribution rollout fell 6 weeks behind, Ethan rebuilt the schedule and delivered it 3 days early. When Aldridge nearly lost its largest Midwest account, Ethan spent 11 nights redesigning the service plan that saved it. When younger managers failed, they called Ethan. When senior executives needed answers, they used reports Ethan had written. He never reminded anyone. At 9:07, Claire stepped to the front. She was 37, composed, precise, and so practiced at hiding uncertainty that most people assumed she never felt it. Ethan knew better. He had seen her alone after brutal board meetings, staring through glass walls before putting the CEO back on her face. Their eyes met briefly. Something in hers made his stomach tighten. Our next vice president of operations, Claire said, will be Derek Shaw. Applause started unevenly. Ethan did not move. Derek stood 3 seats ahead of him, smiling in disbelief. Richard Vance, the COO, was already clapping. Claire looked toward Ethan once. He applauded too. At 9:41, she asked him into her office. I know you expected a different decision, she said. I expected the work to matter. Claire's expression shifted. It does. You're invaluable where you are, Ethan. He held her gaze. Invaluable where you are. 6 years of fixing problems no one else could fix, and the reward was becoming too useful to move. Ethan nodded once. Thank you for telling me yourself. He returned to his desk without arguing. Waiting on his keyboard was the 5-year operations plan he had spent 4 months building. The author line had been changed. It now read, Derek Shaw, Vice President of Operations. Then Ethan's phone lit up with a number he did not recognize. The message contained only 9 words. I heard what happened. We should talk. Jonathan Mercer. For the rest of Monday, Ethan Cole did exactly what he had always done. He answered questions, corrected a shipping forecast, helped a new manager untangle a scheduling problem, and said nothing about the name that had disappeared from his own work. By 5:30, most of the executive floor was empty. Derek Shaw was still inside his new office, rehearsing a presentation Ethan had written. Ethan could hear fragments through the glass. Labor efficiency, regional consolidation, customer retention. Every phrase sounded familiar because every phrase had once existed in Ethan's notebook. He closed his laptop and drove 12 miles home through evening traffic. Sophie was at the kitchen table surrounded by cardboard buildings, blue construction paper, and a bottle of white glue. Her school project had become an entire miniature city. So, she asked before he had removed his coat. Ethan set his keys beside the fruit bowl. Someone else got it. Sophie stopped cutting a cardboard roof. Were they better? Children could ask questions adults spent careers avoiding. Ethan pulled out the chair beside her. They chose who they thought was right. Sophie studied his face with the serious brown eyes she had inherited from her mother. That was not my question. Ethan almost smiled. For years without Rachel had taught him how quickly a quiet house could become too quiet, and Sophie had somehow learned to fill the empty spaces without pretending they were gone. "No," he said finally. "I do not think he was better." Sophie nodded as if that settled something important, then pushed a crooked cardboard tower toward him. "Hold this while the glue dries." 8 months earlier, Aldridge had nearly lost its Phoenix rollout after 3 departments produced 3 incompatible schedules. Richard Vance called an emergency meeting. Derek talked for 20 minutes. Ethan asked for a dry erase marker. In 11 minutes, he mapped the bottleneck across the conference room wall and found a solution nobody had considered. Claire stood near the window, watching him. "How long would that take?" she asked. 6 weeks if we do it the safe way." Richard laughed. "We have 3. Ethan looked at the board. "Then we stop pretending these are 3 separate departments." For the next 21 days, Ethan arrived before sunrise and left in time to pick Sophie up from after-school care. He reorganized the workflow, trained 2 supervisors, and called vendors from his kitchen after Sophie went to bed. Phoenix launched 3 days early. At the quarterly meeting, Richard presented the recovery as an executive operations initiative. Ethan sat in the 4th row and applauded with everyone else. Claire thanked Richard publicly. She thanked Ethan privately in an elevator. "I know what you did," she told him. Ethan looked at the floor numbers changing above the doors. "Then make sure the team gets credit." That answer stayed with her longer than he knew. But Richard remembered it too. By Tuesday morning, Ethan's 5-year plan was circulating under Derek's name. At 8:14, Ethan opened the document history and stared at the revision log. His name had not merely been removed from the cover. 43 tracked references to his authorship had been deleted over the weekend by an executive administrator assigned directly to Richard Vance. Ethan copied the audit record to a private folder, closed the file, and went to his first meeting. At 10:26, Claire received an email from Aldridge's largest Midwest client. The message was only 2 sentences long. "We reviewed the new leadership announcement. Before we renew, we need to understand why Ethan Cole is not leading operations." Claire read the client's message twice before forwarding it to Richard Vance. His reply came 4 minutes later. "Ethan has strong relationships with several accounts. I will handle it." Claire stared at those words longer than she expected. Strong relationships did not explain why a client worth nearly $18 million a year wanted to question an executive promotion. At 8:40, Ethan was downstairs helping a regional manager repair a forecasting model when Claire found him. She rarely came to the operations floor without an assistant. Conversation slowed as she approached. "Ethan, do you have 5 minutes?" He saved the spreadsheet. "Of course." They walked into an empty conference room. Claire closed the door. "Harrison Distribution contacted me this morning." Ethan's expression did not change. "About the promotion? You knew they would?" "No." "Then why are they asking why you are not leading operations?" Ethan considered the question. "Probably because I have worked with them for 5 years." Claire folded her arms. "Richard says you have strong client relationships." "That is true. I feel like there is another answer." Ethan looked through the glass wall toward his team. "There usually is." Claire waited, but he offered nothing more. That restraint irritated her because it felt less like defiance than disappointment. What she did not know was that Ethan had never wanted the promotion for the title. 2 years earlier, Sophie had been 7 when he missed her school science night because a distribution failure kept him at Aldridge until nearly 10. He arrived home to find her asleep on the couch beside a cardboard solar system. A blue ribbon rested on the coffee table. The next morning, she did not complain. She simply asked, "Did you fix it?" Ethan said yes. Sophie smiled. "Then somebody needed you." That sentence stayed with him. He began noticing how many people at Aldridge lived the same way. Parents missing dinners. Supervisors answering emails at midnight. Good employees treated as unreliable because emergencies at home did not fit neatly. Inside quarterly reports. When a vice president position opened, Ethan saw a chance to change that. His 5-year plan was not only about reducing costs. It proposed flexible scheduling, cross-trained teams, protected family leave, and performance measurements based on results instead of hours spent visibly sitting at a desk. The plan projected a 12% reduction in turnover within 18 months. Richard called it soft management. Ethan called it common sense. Claire had never seen that section. The version Richard placed in her review packet contained financial projections, automation targets, and expansion schedules, but 17 pages concerning workforce reform were missing. At 11:15 Tuesday morning, Richard entered Claire's office carrying Ethan's personnel evaluation. "You want a context?" he said. Claire opened it. Ethan's technical scores were exceptional. His leadership recommendation was not. At the bottom, Richard had written a single assessment. Ethan Cole demonstrates unusual operational ability, but lacks the executive presence and personal availability required for senior leadership. Claire looked up. Personal availability? Richard gave a practiced sigh. He is a devoted father. Admirable, certainly. But executive leadership requires sacrifice. Across town, Ethan sat in Sophie's school cafeteria because he had promised 6 months earlier that he would attend parent lunch Tuesday. His phone remained face down in his pocket. Sophie opened her lunchbox and grinned. "You actually came." "I said I would." 20 minutes later, back at Alderidge, Claire opened Ethan's original promotion application. Attached to it was a document Richard had apparently overlooked. The first page began with 3 words, people or infrastructure. Claire kept reading. By page 17, she understood that someone had deliberately prevented her from seeing the most important part of Ethan's plan. Then her phone rang. Jonathan Mercer was asking whether Ethan Cole was still under contract. Claire did not answer Jonathan Mercer immediately. She looked through the glass wall of her office at the city 30 floors below, then back at Ethan's original plan. "Why are you asking?" she said. Jonathan gave a quiet laugh. "That sounds like a question from someone who has not figured out what she has yet." The line went silent. Claire's hand tightened around the phone. "Ethan is employed by Alderidge." "Good. Then my information is current." Jonathan ended the call before she could ask anything else. At 12:20, Claire summoned Richard. She placed the missing 17 pages on her desk between them. "Why were these removed from my review packet?" Richard barely glanced down. "Because they were irrelevant to the promotion decision. A projected 12% reduction in turnover is irrelevant. The assumptions are optimistic." Claire turned another page. 3 regional directors endorsed them. Richard sat opposite her without being invited. "Claire, you asked me to identify someone who could operate at the executive level. Ethan is talented, but talent is not leadership. And Derek is? Derek understands what the job requires." What Richard did not say was that Derek also understood Richard. For 3 years, Ethan had become dangerous without realizing it. Department heads called him before they called the executive office. Clients trusted his estimates. Warehouse supervisors used procedures he had designed. New managers learned operations from him before they ever met Richard. Ethan had accumulated influence without chasing it, which made that influence harder to control. Promoting him would have placed a title beside authority he already possessed. Richard had no intention of allowing that. At 1:45, Ethan returned from Sophie's school and found Derek waiting beside his desk. "I need you in conference room 4, Derek said. "What for?" "The Harrison renewal. They want changes to the service model." Ethan checked the clock. "That account belongs to your new division." Derek lowered his voice. "Come on, Ethan. We both know you understand it better than anyone." Ethan looked at him for a moment. 6 years of instinct told him to stand up, enter the room, solve the problem, and make sure nobody else paid for an executive mistake. Instead, he asked, "Am I leading operations?" Derek blinked. "You know you are not. Then you should lead." Ethan turned back to his screen. It was not revenge. He answered every question within his job, completed every responsibility under his title, and helped every employee assigned to him. He simply stopped performing executive work for free. By 3:10, the difference was visible. Derek postponed the Harrison meeting. A Denver manager requested approval nobody knew how to authorize. A vendor dispute sat unanswered because Richard assumed Ethan would quietly resolve it. Claire watched the delays accumulate on her dashboard. For the first time, She could see the shape of all the invisible work Ethan had been carrying. At 4:30, she walked downstairs and found him alone in a conference room reviewing inventory projections. "You knew this would happen," she said. Ethan looked up. "I knew what I was doing before. Why did you never tell me how much? You never asked." There was no accusation in his voice. That made it worse. Claire pulled out the chair opposite him. "Jonathan Mercer called me." For the first time that day, Ethan's expression changed. Only slightly. Claire noticed. "He asked whether you were still under contract." Ethan closed the report. "I have never spoken to him." "Then why is my biggest competitor asking about you?" Ethan considered the question, but before he could answer, his phone vibrated. The same unknown number had sent another message. Thursday morning, 7:30. Lakeview Grill. No recruiters. No lawyers. Just breakfast. Ethan read it once. Across the table, Claire watched his face become unreadable. She did not know Jonathan Mercer had spent nearly 2 years collecting the answer to a question Aldridge had never bothered to ask. Who was actually keeping its most important clients from leaving? Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. At 7:26, Ethan stepped in a Lakeview Grill wearing a charcoal jacket over the same white shirt he had worn to Sophie's school conference the month before. Jonathan Mercer was already seated in a booth, near the window with 2 cups of coffee and a black leather folder beside his hand. He stood when Ethan approached. "Thank you for coming." Ethan sat across from him. "You said no recruiters." "There are none. No lawyers." "Not yet." Jonathan pushed one coffee toward him. "Black. I was told that is how you take it." Ethan did not reach for the cup. "Who told you?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "That is the first useful question you have asked." He opened the folder and removed a stack of reports. The first carried the logo of Harrison Distribution. The second belonged to a Denver manufacturing client. The third was an internal performance analysis from a joint Aldridge and Mercer project 18 months earlier. Ethan recognized everyone. "You have been looking into me." "For 22 months. Ethan leaned back. Jonathan tapped the first report. "Harrison was preparing to leave Aldridge 2 years ago. You redesigned their service model." He touched the second. "Denver had a 12% fulfillment failure rate. You brought it below 3% in 1 quarter. Then the third. "My company lost nearly $4 million on this project before you found a routing error our own consultants missed." Ethan remembered the project. He also remembered Richard presenting the final recovery plan to both companies. "Richard led that meeting," Ethan said. "Richard, read the slides." Jonathan's voice stayed calm. "You built them." A server placed 2 plates on the table. Neither man touched the food. Jonathan closed the reports. "I have spent 34 years building Mercer Dynamics. We employ 1,100 people in 6 states. I turned 62 in January, and my board thinks I should sell to a private equity group before I retire." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I do not want to sell." Jonathan slid the black folder across the table. Ethan opened it. The first page read President and Designated Successor. Beneath it was an equity schedule that increased over 5 years, followed by an option allowing Ethan to acquire Jonathan's controlling shares when Jonathan retired. Ethan looked up. "You are offering me your job?" "Eventually." Jonathan shook his head. "Right now, I am offering you the chance to learn every part of my company while you lead it beside me. When I leave, I want you in my chair." Ethan looked down again. "You barely know me. I know what people do when nobody expects them to get credit." Jonathan pointed to the reports. "That tells me more than a resume." Ethan turned another page. The compensation was substantial. The equity was larger than anything he had imagined owning. But his eyes stopped on the travel requirements. "My daughter is 9. "I know." Ethan's expression cooled. "You investigated Sophie?" "Only enough to know that any offer requiring you to become less of a father would be an offer you would refuse." Jonathan removed 1 sheet from the folder. The role included limited overnight travel, a Chicago-based schedule, and protected flexibility for school obligations. Ethan stared at it. Jonathan had understood in 22 months what Aldridge had failed to understand in 6 years. Still, Ethan closed the folder. "I did not make decisions like this without my daughter." Jonathan nodded. That is one of the reasons the offer is yours. At 6:12 that evening, Ethan placed the folder on his kitchen table. Sophie was adding tiny paper trees to her cardboard city. She glanced at the Mercer logo, then at him. Is that another job? Something like that. Would you be the boss? Ethan smiled slightly. Eventually, Sophie thought for a moment. She did not ask about money, the office, or the title. She asked the only question that mattered. Would you still have time to be my dad? Sophie's question stayed between them longer than any number in Jonathan Mercer's offer. Ethan looked at the cardboard city covering half the kitchen table. One building had a crooked blue roof. Another leaned slightly because Sophie had used too much glue. Near the center stood a tiny school with a yellow paper bus parked outside. Yes, Ethan said. If I cannot still be your dad, I do not take the job. Sophie considered that with the seriousness she usually reserved for science projects. Then ask them. Ask them what? If being the boss means missing everything. Ethan smiled. That is a pretty good question. I am 9. I have good questions. The next morning, Ethan called Jonathan before sunrise. They spoke for 23 minutes. Ethan asked about travel, hiring authority, family leave, remote work, and whether the flexibility promised to him would also exist for employees below him. Jonathan answered each question without hesitation until Ethan reached the last one. If I become president, can I change the policies? There was a pause. Which policies? The ones that assume commitment is measured by how much of your life you surrender. Jonathan was quiet for 3 seconds. That is exactly what I would expect the president to change. Ethan did not accept the offer. Not yet. He asked for the weekend. At Alderidge, meanwhile, something unusual was happening. Nothing was collapsing. No alarm sounded. No dramatic crisis appeared. The company was simply becoming slower. Problems Ethan once solved before anyone noticed them now remained visible. At 9:15, Derek sent 3 emails asking who had authority to approve a revised carrier agreement. At 10:40, Denver postponed a shipment because nobody had reconciled 2 conflicting forecasts. Shortly after noon, Harrison Distribution requested another meeting and specifically asked that Ethan attend. Richard appeared beside Ethan's desk at 12:37. Harrison wants you upstairs. Ethan kept reading the inventory report on his screen. Is Derek leading the meeting? Yes. Then Derek should lead it. Richard lowered his voice. Do not make this personal. Ethan finally looked at him. I'm doing the job Claire decided I should have. Richard had no answer that sounded good when stated plainly. From the executive floor, Claire watched the operational dashboard turn yellow one item at a time. She had spent years believing Alderidge had systems strong enough to survive any individual employee. Now she was discovering that many of those systems worked because Ethan quietly stood between their weaknesses. At 2:10, Claire opened the audit history of his 5-year plan again. She followed the revision trail backward, then requested archived promotion files from Human Resources. By 3, she had found 4 evaluations written by Ethan's department directors. All 4 recommended him for executive leadership. None had appeared in the packet Richard gave her. One included a sentence Claire read twice. Ethan Cole already leads across departments without title, leverage, or recognition. Claire leaned back slowly. She remembered telling him he lacked executive readiness. She had not evaluated Ethan. She had evaluated a version of Ethan someone else had constructed for her. At 3:28, her assistant called. Harrison Distribution is on line 1. Their president says he will only discuss renewal with you directly. Claire took the call. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, she remained seated with the receiver in her hand. Harrison was prepared to delay an $18 million renewal, not because Ethan had threatened to leave. He had said nothing to them. They simply no longer trusted Alderidge's leadership judgment. At 4:11, Claire went downstairs. Ethan's desk was empty. For one sharp second, she thought he had resigned. Then she noticed a small note from his manager. Left at 4. Daughter's science fair. Claire stood there looking at those 4 words. 6 years earlier, she would have considered leaving during business hours evidence that someone lacked ambition. Now she understood something Richard never had. Ethan did not arrange his daughter around his career. He arranged his career around being her father. and somehow he had still become the person everyone called when the difficult work mattered. Claire returned upstairs and opened Ethan's personnel file. At 4:36, another email arrived. Jonathan Mercer had requested a formal meeting with Aldridge's board for Monday morning concerning what he called a strategic leadership matter. Attached was the attendee list. Jonathan Mercer, Ethan Cole. Claire read Ethan's name once, then looked at the unsigned succession documents she had quietly obtained from legal contacts that afternoon. For the first time, she understood what Jonathan was offering him. Not another position, not a larger salary, a company. And on Monday morning, Richard Vance was going to discover that the man he had worked hardest to keep beneath him was about to enter the boardroom with the power to walk away from all of them. Monday morning, Ethan arrived at Aldridge at 8:52, wearing the navy suit Sophie had straightened for him the week before. Jonathan Mercer entered 6 minutes later, carrying the same black leather folder from Lakeview Grill. By 9, every seat in the executive boardroom was filled. Claire sat at the head of the table. Richard Vance sat to her right, Derek Shaw, 2 chairs. Farther down, Ethan took the last open seat beside Jonathan. Nobody offered him the 4th row this time. Richard broke the silence first. I'm still unclear why a competitor is attending an internal leadership meeting. Jonathan placed a folder on the table. You'll be clear shortly. Claire looked at Ethan. Before we begin, Harrison Distribution has asked to join remotely. The screen at the end of the room illuminated, showing Harrison, President Michael Grant, and 2 senior executives. Michael skipped the greetings. Our renewal is scheduled for Friday. Before we sign, we need confidence in Aldridge's operating leadership. Richard leaned forward. Derek Shaw has our full support. Michael looked directly into the camera. With respect, I was not asking about Derek Shaw. The room became still. For 5 years, every serious problem on our account has eventually reached Ethan Cole. When our Midwest network failed during the holiday season, he rebuilt the routing schedule in 48 hours. When our costs rose 11%, he found a contract error nobody else noticed. We stayed with Aldridge because we trusted him. Richard forced a smile. Ethan is a capable manager, but executive decisions require a broader perspective. Michael did not hesitate. Then why has your capable manager been making the decisions that kept us here? Claire lowered her eyes to the documents in front of her. Jonathan opened his folder. That is not an isolated example. He distributed 6 reports around the table. Denver, Phoenix, Harrison, 2 supplier recoveries, 1 joint project with Mercer Dynamics. Each document traced a major operational success back to Ethan. Not Richard, not Derek. Ethan. Richard flipped through the pages. This proves he contributed. It does not prove he led. Ethan finally spoke. Page 32. Richard stopped. What? The Phoenix recovery. Page 32. Richard turned there. 27 employee names appeared beneath the implementation record. Ethan's was last. Those people did the work, Ethan said. I built the system that let them do it. Leadership is not putting your name first. Nobody answered. Claire looked at Richard. Why were Ethan's recommendations removed from my promotion packet? Richard's face remained controlled. I filter material according to relevance. You removed 4 leadership endorsements. I exercised executive judgment. Claire slid another document across the table. You also removed 43 authorship references from his 5-year plan. Derek looked at Richard for the first time. Richard said nothing. Jonathan waited until the silence had done its work. Then he placed a single document in front of Ethan. My board approved this yesterday. Ethan looked down. President of Mercer Dynamics. Designated successor to the Chief Executive Officer. 5-year equity transfer agreement. Jonathan's signature was already at the bottom. A low murmur moved around the table. Richard stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Claire did not look at the compensation. She looked at Ethan's face. He was exactly as calm as he had been when she denied him the promotion. That was when she understood the real reversal. A week earlier, Ethan had needed Aldridge to choose him. Now Aldridge needed Ethan to choose them. Richard leaned toward him. You cannot seriously be considering this. Ethan met his eyes. Why not? Because you've spent 6 years here. I know. We built your career. Ethan was quiet for a moment. No, I built my work here. There is a difference. Jonathan pushed a pen across the table, but Ethan left it untouched. Claire stood. Everyone expected a counteroffer. Instead, she looked directly at Ethan. Do not sign anything yet. Richard exhaled in relief. Claire turned toward him. Not because I am asking Ethan to stay. She placed the audit records beside his evaluation files. Because before he makes his decision, this board is going to hear exactly how we failed him. Starting with you, Richard. Richard Vance did not leave the boardroom immediately. Men who had spent years controlling information rarely understood how quickly control disappeared once everyone could see the documents. He straightened the papers in front of him and looked toward the directors. Claire, this is becoming emotional. Claire remained standing. No, it became factual the moment I opened the audit history. She placed Ethan's original promotion file beside the version Richard had prepared for her. For leadership endorsements removed. 17 pages removed from his strategic plan. 43 authorship references deleted. You did not advise me. You decided what I was allowed to know. Richard glanced toward Derek. I made a recommendation, and I accepted it, Claire said. That stopped the room. She could have made Richard carry the entire failure. Instead, she turned toward the board. He manipulated the process. I signed the decision. Ethan deserved better judgment from me. Ethan watched without speaking. An apology delivered when nothing was at risk was easy. Claire was apologizing while her board, her largest client, and her strongest competitor were watching. More importantly, she was not asking for anything in return. By 11:15, Richard had been placed on administrative leave pending an independent review. Derek's promotion was suspended until the selection process could be reopened. Claire ordered Human Resources to restore the authorship records on Ethan's work and commissioned an outside review of every executive promotion from the previous 3 years. Then she did something Ethan had not expected. She asked Harrison to remain on the screen. Michael, your concern about our leadership judgment was justified. We will earn back your confidence. Ethan will not be responsible for doing that unless he chooses to be. Michael nodded slowly. That is the first answer today that makes me comfortable renewing. Jonathan closed his folder. He looked almost pleased, though Ethan could not tell whether it was because Claire had finally understood or because Mercer had just gained the advantage. The meeting ended at 11:48. Ethan was halfway to the elevator when Claire called his name. He stopped. She approached alone. No assistant. No board members. No counteroffer in her hand. I owe you an apology that is not attached to a request, she said. Ethan waited. I believed I was evaluating your readiness. I was actually evaluating information selected to keep you where you were useful. But Richard did not make the final decision. I did. Ethan looked at her. Yes. The single word landed harder than anger would have. Claire nodded. I told you that you were invaluable where you were. I thought it was praise. It meant you valued what I did more than where I could go. She absorbed that without defending herself. You are right. The elevator arrived, but neither moved toward it. I am fixing the records, Claire continued. I'm changing the promotion review process. Your workforce proposal will go to the board under your name, whether you stay or leave. And the people whose work disappeared behind executive titles are getting their credit restored. Ethan studied her face. You know that does not mean I will stay. I know, and you are doing it anyway. I should have done it before I had something to lose. For the first time since the promotion announcement, Ethan saw something different in her. Not the chief executive officer who controlled the room. Not the woman who had made the wrong decision. Someone willing to accept that correcting a wrong did not purchase forgiveness. Thank you, he said. Claire gave a small nod. Whatever you choose, Ethan, Aldridge will tell the truth about what you did here. That evening, Sophie was sitting on the living room floor when Ethan came home. The black Mercer folder rested where he had left it on the kitchen counter. Did you ask them? She said. Ethan hung up his coat. I did. Can you still come to my stuff? Yes. Even the boring stuff? Especially the boring stuff. Sophie smiled and returned to her cardboard city. Ethan sat beside her and opened the folder to the signature page. Before he could pick up the pen, his phone lit up with a message from Claire. It contained no offer and no request to stay. Just a photograph of Aldridge's revised 5-year strategy on the boardroom screen. Beneath the title, for the first time, were the words, prepared by Ethan Cole and the Aldridge operations team. Ethan looked at the photograph for several seconds, then reached for the pen. The pen moved once across the signature line. Ethan Cole did not celebrate. He did not call Richard. He did not post anything online or imagine walking through Aldridge while everyone watched him leave. He simply signed his name, closed the folder, and looked across the kitchen table at Sophie. I took it. She looked up from her cardboard city. The boss job, and you could still come to my science fair? Ethan smiled. That was part of the deal. Sophie nodded with satisfaction. Then it sounds like a good company. 6 weeks later, Ethan walked into Mercer Dynamics as president. Jonathan kept the office beside his, exactly as promised, and spent each morning teaching Ethan the parts of the business no performance report could explain. Ethan changed nothing during his first week. During his second, he met with warehouse supervisors, customer service representatives, engineers, drivers, and regional managers. He asked the same question in every room. What problem does everyone know about, but nobody believes leadership will fix? By the end of the month, he had 47 answers. By the end of the second month, 12 were already solved. At Aldridge, Claire kept her promises too. The independent review confirmed that Richard had manipulated promotion records and redirected credit across multiple projects. His employment ended after the review. Derek returned to his previous role and, to Ethan's surprise, sent him a short message admitting he should have questioned where the 5-year plan came from. Claire rebuilt the promotion process around documented results, peer evaluations, and transparent authorship. Harrison renewed its $18 million contract. 3 months later, Aldridge and Mercer Dynamics found themselves competing for a national distribution project worth more than $60 million. Claire called Ethan directly. I have a proposal, she said. That sentence used to make me nervous. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her do it without immediately becoming serious again. Her proposal was simple. Neither company could serve the client efficiently alone. Together, they could. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned to Aldridge's boardroom, not as an employee asking to be recognized, but as the president of the company sitting across the table. Claire did not treat him differently because his title had changed. That mattered to him more than he expected. Their meetings became lunches. Lunches became occasional phone calls that had nothing to do with contracts. Claire learned that Ethan made terrible pancakes, but excellent grilled cheese. Ethan learned that Claire, who could negotiate an 8-figure agreement without notes, became completely confused inside a grocery store without a list. Still, he moved carefully. Respect had returned before trust, and trust needed time. Claire seemed to understand that. She never pushed. The real change happened on a Thursday afternoon in May. Sophie's school science fair began at 5:30. Ethan arrived at 5:12 carrying 2 coffees and expecting an empty chair beside him. At 5:27, Claire walked through the gymnasium doors wearing a simple cream sweater instead of a business suit. You came, Ethan said. Sophie invited me. Sophie appeared beside her cardboard city before Claire could say more. The crooked buildings had been rebuilt. Tiny streets ran between a school, a factory, houses, parks, and 3 office towers. This is the final version, Sophie announced. Claire leaned closer. We're the 3 towers. Sophie pointed to the first. Dad's company. Then the second. Your company. Claire pointed to the third. And that one. Sophie shrugged. I do not know yet. Some things are still being built. Ethan looked at Claire. She looked back, and neither tried to give the moment a name before it. Was ready. Months later, Jonathan would joke that Ethan had received the largest promotion he never applied for. But Ethan never thought of it that way. The company was opportunity. Claire's respect was something they rebuilt. The evenings with Sophie were the life he had protected through all of it. And when the 3 of them eventually began sharing more of those evenings, it happened quietly, without contracts, announcements, or promises made too soon. Ethan had once believed being valued meant finally receiving the right title. He learned something better. Real value was being seen clearly, being trusted with responsibility, and still being free to come home to the people who knew your worth before your name was ever written on an office door.